Before we begin, leave a comment with where you're watching from and the exact minute your clock shows when these words reach you. Time and place matter in stories like this, because every disappearance begins at a single point on the map and a single moment that refuses to stay still. The year was 2011, late September, in the Colorado high country, when the aspens were turning gold and the season felt like it was holding its breath before the first storm. That was when a 34-year-old woman walked into the mountains and did not come back. 7 years later, deep in a forgotten valley, searchers would force open the door of a cabin no one remembered standing, and inside they would find a table still set for 2 plates, utensils, a cooking pot crusted with time, and the remains of a woman sitting upright at the far chair, as if she had been waiting for someone who never arrived. This is the story of what happened between those 2 moments, and why the mountains kept their silence for so long. It began with a drive out of Denver on a Friday morning, the kind of morning when the sky looks newly washed and the air feels thin. The woman is known among her friends for her precise routines, her habit of verifying trail reports twice, and her way of photographing even the smallest changes in weather left before dawn, heading toward the Elk Ridge backcountry. According to the mileage tracker on her vehicle, she stopped once for gas near Silverthorne and once more on a turnout overlooking a valley that locals said looked painted in autumn. She sent a short message to a coworker at 7:52 a simple line, "Headed up. Should be back Sunday night." That message would become the last time anyone confirmed she was alive. Her plan, according to the notes found later in her home, was a 2-night loop starting at a well-marked trailhead and circling through a chain of lakes before returning via a ridge route. She had prepared carefully: dehydrated meals portioned by day, a laminated map marked with mileage estimates, 2 weatherproof notebooks, and a camera she used religiously. She was known for being cautious, conservative even, not the kind of person who wandered off trail or extended a route without telling someone. When she didn't clock in for her Monday shift, coworkers assumed she was delayed by weather. By Tuesday morning, when her phone remained off and her mailbox held the weekend mail, her sister contacted local authorities. Deputies found her SUV at the trailhead, locked, windows up, with no sign of disturbance. Her pack was gone, as it should have been. But on the passenger seat lay a folded bandana she normally took with her on hikes, and that small inconsistency would trouble investigators for years. The sheriff's office launched a search within the hour. Volunteers arrived from 2 counties. Search and rescue teams began the routine grid sweeps, moving outward from the trailhead in expanding loops. Dogs were deployed by afternoon, and by evening a helicopter scanned the drainage, reporting no signs of a campfire, reflective gear, or distress signal. For the first 48 hours, the search followed standard assumptions: an injury, misstep, or disorientation. But the early clues unsettled even seasoned rescuers. Her initial boot prints were easy to identify. Heavy tread, narrow stride, but half a mile up the trail they simply vanished, as if swallowed by the earth or erased by hands careful enough to leave no debris. That stretch of trail was sheltered and dry, not a place where prints dissolve easily. A veteran tracker later stated in his report, "It was as though she stepped off the trail and the ground refused to record her passage. No broken branches, no skid marks, no slide debris, just absence." On the 3rd day, a storm swept across the ridge, dropping sleet and burying whatever faint traces might have been left. Teams pushed deeper toward the lakes, the meadows, and the couloirs where hikers sometimes fall. But every check came back empty. Campsites showed no recent use. Fire rings were cold. Bear tracks crossed mud but showed no interaction with human scent. It was, in the words of one rescuer interviewed long after, like searching for a shadow in a valley made of mirrors. By the end of the first week, local authorities shifted the case classification from overdue hiker to missing person. Flyers went up across the mountain towns. Her family drove in, her sister carrying a binder of photographs to show volunteers. The official search scaled down, then up again briefly, after a hiker reported hearing a woman's voice in a ravine. An auditory illusion, the expert said later, caused by wind slipping between rock faces like a mouth forming words. The hiker insisted otherwise. For 2 days, teams combed that ravine. Nothing. 7 years would pass before anyone understood that the truth was hiding not in the open valleys or on the ridgelines, but in a collapsed logging road 5 miles off any marked trail, where a cabin stood without a listing, without a record, without a history, and inside it, a table set for 2. In the years that followed the initial search, the case settled uneasily into the pattern familiar to mountain communities. Vigils were held, rumors circulated, and a few tips trickled in every couple of months, all of them dissolving under scrutiny. Her family returned to the trailhead each anniversary, placing a small cairn beside a spruce whose branches bent low like a protective hand. Hikers who passed through often found her photo laminated and tied to the trail marker, the edges worn by sun and wind. But as happens in cases where evidence is scarce and the land is vast, official attention faded. Files moved from active shelves to archival drawers. The missing woman became a cautionary tale, whispered by rangers to unprepared visitors. Even the careful can vanish if the mountains decide they're not ready to give them back. 7 years is a long time in the high country. Trails shift, fallen trees reroute paths. Snowmelt eats away at old logging roads, turning them into narrow corridors of brush where only animals pass. It was along one of these forgotten roads, a spur that no longer appeared on modern maps, that 2 seasonal wildlife surveyors walked on a mild July morning. Their assignment was to routinely record signs of elk migration and note changes in vegetation patterns, but one of them later recalled a strange smell drifting on the breeze. Not decay exactly, but something stale, as if a building had been sealed too long. They followed it without much thought, expecting the remnants of an old shed or hunter's blind. What they found instead was a structure that should not have been there. The cabin stood in a grove of firs, its roof sagging under the weight of years, its windows clouded with dust and pollen. At first glance, it resembled any number of private backcountry shelters built decades earlier in places loggers slept during seasonal work or where ranchers stored feed, but something felt wrong. The wildlife surveyors noted subtle inconsistencies. No path leading to the door, no footprints in the dirt despite recent rains, and no sign of animals pushing through the brush to investigate the place. Animals are curious by instinct. They avoid little in the forest. But the ground around the cabin looked untouched, as though nature itself hesitated to come closer. They approached with caution. One called out, just in case the cabin was occupied. Silence answered. When they tried the door, it resisted at first, then gave way with a brittle snap of swollen wood. The smell inside was colder and denser, as though the air had been trapped for years and only now rushed past them, carrying dust motes that shimmered in the shafts of light. One of the surveyors stepped in, took a few paces, then froze. In the center of the single room stood a small wooden table. On it were 2 plates, 2 sets of utensils, a pot with the remnants of a meal dried into a cracked shell, and 2 chairs, one pulled out, the other tucked in neatly. Opposite the pulled-out chair, at the far side of the room, sat the remains of a woman, positioned as though she had been waiting for another person to join her. The wildlife surveyors backed out immediately, called their supervisor, and within an hour, the sheriff's office had dispatched deputies and forensic technicians. The cabin was taped off. No one was allowed inside until the team could document the untouched scene. When they did, each detail deepened the sense of unease. The plates had been set with a deliberateness that suggested intention rather than accident. The pot on the table contained remnants of dehydrated stew, a brand still sold today but packaged differently 7 years earlier. The utensils were mismatched. One metal, one plastic, as if assembled without concern for uniformity. And the chair facing the remains had been angled slightly, like someone had been preparing to sit beside her rather than across from her. Deputies noted the posture of the body. The woman's skeletal frame leaned against the chair back at a gentle angle, her hands resting in her lap, fingers curled naturally rather than in tension. Her jacket, though faded and brittle, matched the description given in the missing persons report from 2011. Even more telling was the necklace, a small, flat stone on a cord that her sister had mentioned in every interview. It had been custom-made, one of a the kind of item that confirmed identity even before forensic comparison. The true shock, however, came from the surroundings. No dust covered the plates or pot, despite the years that had supposedly passed. No rodent droppings, no nesting materials in corners, and no evidence of insects feeding on remnants of food. The interior was unnaturally undisturbed, like a sealed room in which time had stopped. Windows that should have let in wind remained intact. Floorboards that should have warped from humidity lay untouched. Investigators struggled to explain why the scene appeared both aged and perfectly preserved. Outside, the wildlife surveyors told deputies that they had walked the area the previous season and had never noticed the cabin before. They were certain, absolutely certain, it had not been there. Yet the structure showed decades of weathering, with old nails, rotting boards, and a chimney coated with soot from fires burned long ago. A building cannot simply appear in the wilderness. And yet, by every account, that was precisely what had happened. As investigators prepared to move the remains, one deputy lifted a corner of the tablecloth and paused. Underneath, pressed between the cloth and the wood, was a folded scrap of paper. On it were 3 words, written in faint pencil, that would redefine the next years of the investigation and reopen every assumption once thought settled. The scrap of paper was removed with gloved hands, placed in a small evidence envelope, and carried outside where the light was stronger. The pencil marks were faint, smudged at the edges, as if touched repeatedly by nervous fingers. 3 simple, unadorned, and unsettling words in their ambiguity. Investigators would not release those words to the public for months, but those present at the scene remembered the moment the detective in charge read them aloud. They remembered how the wildlife surveyors stepped back instinctively, as though the message had been waiting for them personally. They remembered how the breeze seemed to quiet, how even the insects fell still for a moment, because those 3 words were not a plea, not a name, not a farewell. They were a warning, a directive, a quiet echo from someone who had either lost hope or believed that hope was useless. While the paper was transported to the lab, technicians continued documenting the cabin. Everything was photographed, everything was measured. The condition of the doorframe, the alignment of the chairs, the position of the pot on the table, the absence of dust on the rim of a glass that remained upright beside the plate. As the investigation unfolded, a sense of deliberate staging began to take shape, as if the space had been arranged with care or perhaps maintained periodically by someone returning in secret. But if that were true, why were there no footprints, no paths, no evidence of life, inside or outside? The cabin existed in a paradox, too preserved to be abandoned, yet too untouched to be lived in. When the remains were finally examined, the forensic anthropologist noted that the position of the bones suggested the woman had not collapsed, but had been placed upright after death. Ligaments had deteriorated in a way that indicated the body had been moved before full decomposition. The fractures in the ribs were old, consistent with a fall or blunt impact occurring years earlier. But the hyoid bone showed subtle stress fractures that raised immediate concerns. In cases of manual strangulation, such fractures are common. In cases of suicide, far less so. The forensic report would later state, cause of death undetermined, manner of death suspicious. The discovery of the cabin overturned the earlier assumption that the woman had succumbed to the elements. She had survived long enough, or been kept long enough, to reach a structure no one knew existed. But the question that tormented investigators was how she had reached it. The cabin was more than 5 miles from her intended route, across difficult terrain that included a steep ravine and dense brush. There were no signs she had traveled the distance alone. The absence of discarded items, no broken trekking pole, no lost glove, no torn strap, suggested she had been guided or carried. And there was something else. Something one deputy mentioned only after reviewing his body cam footage. The cabin door had been secured from the outside with a metal hook, the kind that could be fastened quickly and silently. No wild animal would do that. No natural event would do that. Attention shifted to old maps and records. The cabin did not appear on any recent survey, but in the archives of the county assessor's office, investigators found a faded blueprint labeled only Ridge Shelter, 1952. There were no tax entries, no ownership changes, and no reported demolitions. It was as if the structure had been built and then intentionally erased. An accompanying document mentioned temporary use by logging crews during a short-lived timber operation. Those crews, according to the notes, were mostly seasonal hires who drifted between jobs. Few names were listed. Fewer still had traceable records. In the 50s, paperwork was often loose, especially in remote regions. The sheriff's office released a public statement confirming the identification of the remains. The media seized on the more dramatic details. 7 years missing, a vanished hiker found in a mysterious cabin. But authorities withheld specifics about the table, the staged meal, and the note. They feared sensationalizing the case would attract opportunists to the site. Despite their efforts, people whispered. Locals spoke of strange lights seen in the forest in the early years after the disappearance. One hunter told deputies he once heard the faint sound of metal striking wood deep in the valley, a rhythmic noise that echoed between the slopes. He had assumed it was an animal kicking at a feeder. Now he wasn't so sure. The woman's family returned to Colorado shortly after the identification. They were allowed to visit the cabin from the outside only, given the area was still an active crime scene. Her sister stood for a long time staring at the weathered boards, as if trying to see through them into the final moments her sibling had spent there. In interviews, she said she felt two competing truths: relief that her sister had been found, and dread at the knowledge that she had not died alone. The chair, the table, the pot, and the note each suggested the presence of another person in her final hours. Detectives agreed. They began reconstructing the timeline between her disappearance and the estimated time of death. Forensic entomology on trace insect remains found near the cabin window suggested she had likely died within a few weeks of vanishing. But that only sharpened the central question. Where had she been during those weeks? And who had brought her to the cabin? In an effort to answer those questions, investigators turned to the few clues available. Soil samples, fibers caught in the splintered wood near the door, a footprint found a few yards away, partially preserved in hardened mud, was too large to be hers. A single rusty nail on the porch with strands of fabric wrapped so tightly around it that removal required precision tools. The lab would later determine the fibers did not match her clothing. They belonged to someone else. Someone who had been there. Someone who might still be. In the weeks following the cabin's discovery, investigators began interviewing anyone who had lived, worked, or traveled in the Elk Ridge backcountry during the year of the woman's disappearance. They revisited old witness statements, re-examined search logs, and contacted retired rangers whose memories, though weathered by time, still held fragments of the landscape as it once was. One ranger, an older man with 30 seasons behind him, recalled a detail that, at the time, had felt insignificant. During the second week of the original search, he had found a crude fire ring beside a stream far off established routes. It contained charred bones too small to be human, scraps of food packaging, and a boot print he couldn't match to the missing woman's footwear. He had documented it out of caution, then dismissed it as an old hunter's campfire. When investigators reopened his notes, they realized the fire ring was less than a mile from the forgotten logging road that led to the cabin. They now saw it not as a relic of past use, but as the trace of someone who had been living or hiding deep inside the search radius. This revelation prompted detectives to comb through overlooked tips from the early days of the investigation. Among them was a report from a man who owned a small cabin rental business near the trailhead. He had mentioned seeing a stranger the evening after the woman vanished, a tall figure walking out of the forest with a heavy pack, moving quickly, and avoiding eye contact. The stranger never approached the main road, instead cutting behind a shed and disappearing toward the tree line. At the time, deputies dismissed the account as unrelated backcountry hikers often pass through the area. But now, the description of the stranger's size and gait matched the partial footprint found near the cabin. With renewed urgency, detectives began analyzing the structure itself more thoroughly. The cabin's construction revealed inconsistencies. While the frame appeared to date back to the 50s, several boards on the interior had been replaced more recently. The nails in those boards were modern galvanized steel manufactured after the year 2000. There were signs that the cabin had been maintained by someone who knew how to keep a building functional without drawing attention. Small repairs hidden behind furniture, fresh caulking under layers of dust, and a chimney that, despite its appearance, had been cleared of debris within the last decade. Whoever had used the cabin had understood its isolation and taken steps to preserve it. Investigators also noted the absence of certain elements. There was no bedding, no cookware other than the pot on the table, no personal belongings, no lanterns, no stored food. A cabin used for long-term habitation would typically contain such items. The emptiness felt deliberate. It was as if the structure had been prepared for a specific purpose: temporary shelter, concealment, or something more disturbing. The forensic team focused next on the handwritten note found beneath the tablecloth. Under magnification, they observed faint indentations on the paper, as though it had been pressed against another sheet during writing. Using an electrostatic detection device, analysts recovered partial outlines of additional words, fragmented and incomplete, but enough to suggest the message had originally been part of a longer, torn page. Among the recovered impressions were two phrases: "not alone" and "he waits." Investigators could not determine whether the missing woman had written them or if they belonged to someone else entirely. Meanwhile, a digital forensic specialist examined the woman's camera, which had been found beneath her remains. The memory card was badly degraded, but a handful of corrupted images were partially recovered. Most were blurred landscapes, distorted by moisture damage. One, however, caught the team's attention. In the image's upper left quadrant, almost imperceptible, was the corner of a wooden structure. The roofline matched the cabin's silhouette. Cropped at an angle, it suggested she had taken the photo while standing at a distance, perhaps without wanting to be seen. This raised a crucial new possibility. The woman may have reached the cabin before the person who ultimately brought her inside. She may have been exploring, or seeking help, or fleeing something unseen. If so, her encounter with the cabin was not the end of her story, but the midpoint. Investigators turned their attention to the surrounding terrain. The brush was thick and unbroken, suggesting the cabin had not been accessed recently by more than one person. But 200 yards uphill, a deputy discovered a narrow path carved through the undergrowth. The path was old, marked by subtle depressions in the soil, the kind only repeated footfall creates. It did not appear on any maps. It led not toward the main trails, but deeper into wilderness rarely visited. When officers followed it for half a mile, they reached a rocky overlook that provided a view of the valley below, including the cabin's roofline, barely visible through the trees. Someone had been watching the cabin. Someone had stood at that vantage point often enough to carve a trail with their own feet. Someone who knew the cabin was there long before the searchers did. This discovery strengthened the working theory of the investigation. The woman had not died by accident. She had been taken, guided, or forced into that space. And the one who brought her there had maintained the cabin for years, moving like a shadow along trails only he knew. Detectives presented their findings to the state police. A profiler was assigned to the case. His preliminary assessment was unsettling. The scene suggested ritual, not chance. The table is set for two. The chair was pulled out. The preserved food, the intact windows, the letter, the vantage point. These details, he wrote, were not consistent with opportunistic violence. They reflected planning, familiarity, and control traits of someone who treated the wilderness not as a place to hide, but as a place to rule. The question was no longer simply who had killed the missing woman. The question was how many others had walked those woods, unaware they were being watched. The profiler assigned to the case was a reserved man with a background in wilderness-related homicide cases, where isolation, terrain, and opportunity intersect in ways that blur intention. After reviewing the photographs, field reports, and forensic data, he submitted a detailed behavioral analysis that shifted the investigation's trajectory. According to his assessment, the individual responsible for the woman's death was likely a long-term resident of the region, not a drifter, not a passing stranger, but someone with deep familiarity with trails no longer maintained, logging routes erased from modern maps, and seasonal changes in the terrain. He wrote, "The cabin was not random. It was known, accessed, and prepared. The individual demonstrated territorial thinking. The setting reflects ownership, not legal or documented, but psychological." This idea that the cabin was part of an unseen perimeter belonging to someone unsettled everyone who read it. The profiler noted the pristine condition of the interior and the absence of scavenger activity. Wild animals avoid structures that carry human scent, but not for 7 consecutive years. The implication was that the cabin had been visited periodically, whether to maintain it or to confirm its isolation. Yet these visits left no tracks, no impressions, and no broken branches. Whoever tended the structure moved with a knowledge of the land that surpassed the average hunter or forest worker. The profiler suggested the individual might have grown up in the region or spent decades studying its rhythms. Investigators also returned to the note found beneath the tablecloth. Chemical analysis confirmed the pencil used was manufactured within the last 15 years, but the specific brand was common and untraceable. The handwriting showed signs of stress, irregular pressure, and inconsistent slant, indicative of someone writing under emotional duress. But the most disturbing finding came from the indentations revealed through electrostatic detection, several overlapping strokes inconsistent with the main text, as though a second person had handled the paper later. Those strokes were deliberate, not accidental. Someone had pressed the paper with an object, possibly a fingertip, possibly something sharper, after the note had been written. Parallel to the forensic work, detectives canvassed small towns within a 50-mile radius of Elk Ridge. They inquired about reclusive residents, individuals known for spending long stretches in the forest, or anyone with unexplained absences during the year of the disappearance. In one such town, a community of fewer than 200 residents, a store owner recalled a quiet man who frequented the general store each autumn. Always alone, always buying the same items: dehydrated meals, rope, water-purifying tablets, and occasionally hand tools. He paid in cash, never used a name. She remembered him because he rarely spoke, except once, when she commented on the early snowfall. According to her, he replied, "Up there, snow covers everything except what matters." She had thought it was an odd remark. Now, she repeated it to investigators with a shiver. Another tip came from a former seasonal ranger who remembered issuing a warning to someone fitting a similar description 10 years earlier. The man had been caught fishing in a restricted spawning area. When told to leave, he complied, but walked away without a word, disappearing into the tree line so silently the ranger later described it as like watching fog absorb a shadow. No citation had been written. No identification had been obtained, and the ranger, busy with his duties, had forgotten the incident until the case resurfaced. Meanwhile, lab technicians examined the fibers found wrapped around the rusty nail on the cabin's porch. Under a microscope, they discovered 2 distinct materials. One, consistent with the fabric of the woman's jacket. The other, a heavier synthetic weave, commonly used in older military surplus coats. This discovery prompted a search of surplus stores and online auction logs, but the trail was too broad. Such coats were common among hunters, loggers, and survivalists. Still, the finding reinforced the theory that 2 people had stood at that doorway, one entering and one leaving, at a time when the woman was still alive. The investigation then expanded into older missing person records, some dating back 20, even 30 years. A pattern began to emerge. Individuals who vanished while traveling alone, most in late summer or early autumn, all within a rough triangular region bordered by Elk Ridge to the west, Black Hollow to the east, and the Pinecrest drainage to the south. Many of these disappearances had been attributed to weather, injuries, or wildlife encounters. But when mapped together, they formed a cluster, an invisible boundary enclosing remote valleys and ridges, with the cabin sitting disturbingly close to the center. Detectives called this cluster the Quiet Zone. It was an area where cell service dropped to nothing, where few trails remained maintained, and where the land's topography created natural dead zones for radio communication. Search teams had historically struggled in that region. K-9 units frequently lost scent trails without explanation. Even experienced hikers reported the unsettling feeling of being watched. At first, these reports sounded like folklore, but with the discovery of the cabin, they took on new relevance. As the investigation progressed, a deputy found something in the county records that added yet another thread. In 1996, a man living near the Pinecrest drainage filed a complaint about a trespasser. According to the statement, he saw someone cutting across his property at dusk, carrying what looked like a length of rope and a backpack. He shouted, but the figure did not stop. By the time he reached the tree line, the trespasser had vanished. The responding officer searched briefly but found nothing. The case was closed with the notation, "Likely hunter or lost hiker." The deputy reread the file and noticed a detail overlooked years earlier. The complainant described the trespasser as moving deliberately, like he knew exactly where to step. That phrase echoed the profiler's report nearly 20 years later. Piece by piece, the case was expanding beyond a single cabin and a single disappearance. Investigators now had reason to believe they were dealing with a person, possibly the same person who had traversed those woods for decades, unseen and unchallenged. Someone who carved paths no one else noticed. Someone who maintained a structure no one else found. Someone who had the patience to wait, to watch, and to decide when to act. But still unanswered was the question that had begun haunting every officer involved. Had he stopped 7 years ago? Or was he still out there moving along the same silent trails, unseen by those who walked the mountains, unaware they were not alone? Throughout the winter that followed, the investigation entered what detectives quietly called the dark stretch, a phase where momentum slowed, and every new angle seemed to loop back toward the same unanswered question. Who had held the woman inside that cabin, and for how long? Snow sealed off the mountain roads, and the cabin itself became unreachable for months. All investigators could do was sift through archived maps, old complaints, and decades of wilderness reports, looking for a thread strong enough to pull. One of those threads emerged from an unexpected place, a retired search and rescue volunteer living 3 counties away. He was in his 70s, but his recollection of a particular incident from many years earlier was sharp. In the autumn of 2003, he and another volunteer responded to a call about a missing backpacker. During that search, they found a depression in the forest floor, hidden under a layer of branches and pine needles. It was nothing remarkable, just a hollow about 5 feet wide and 2 feet deep, but something about it felt wrong to him at the time. It wasn't natural, he told detectives. The soil was too smooth, too deliberately tamped. They found nothing else, and assumed it was where an animal had bedded down. But now, after learning about the cabin, he wondered if it could have been an abandoned cache or a hiding place. Detectives compared the man's description to the newly mapped Quiet Zone. The spot he mentioned fell squarely inside it. A team planned to revisit the location once the snow melted. Until then, they could only mark it as yet another unresolved waypoint on a map that was beginning to resemble a web. Meanwhile, laboratory specialists continued analyzing the cabin's contents at a painstaking pace. The fabric samples recovered from the tablecloth produced a faint but identifiable genetic profile. It wasn't complete degradation that had destroyed large sections, but what remained suggested the touch DNA of a second individual, Not the victim, someone else, possibly male, possibly older. The analysts emphasized the uncertainties, but detectives circled the result in their notes, a partial confirmation of what they already suspected. The victim had not been alone in those final hours, and the tables set for two had not been symbolic. Around the same time, a quiet debate emerged among investigators regarding the timeline. Officially, the woman had been dead for years. Forensic analysis of bone tissue, insect activity, and environmental wear supported this. But several details bothered the lead detective. The food on the plates had decomposed too evenly and too thoroughly to be contemporary with the time of death. The chaos of scavengers or rot should have altered it significantly. The plates had dust, but not the kind one would expect from 7 winters. The chairs at the table cast impressions on the wood floor that suggested they had been moved more recently. And one of the stove's burners showed signs of soot layering inconsistent with long-term vacancy. None of this proved the cabin had been visited in the last few years, but it suggested the possibility. When detectives presented these findings to the profiler, he nodded, as though expecting them. According to his interpretation, the suspect might have returned to the cabin periodically out of ritual, guilt, compulsion, or a twisted sense of ownership. This type doesn't abandon their space, he said. They maintain it. They revisit memories the way others revisit photographs. While investigators focused on evidence, family members struggled with the growing awareness that the woman's final days had likely been marked by fear and isolation. Her brother visited the station multiple times, asking for updates that detectives did not yet have. Friends formed a small support network, sharing memories and coping strategies, knowing that closure would come slowly, if at all. In interviews, those closest to her described her as steady, kind, and deeply connected to the outdoors. She was not reckless, they insisted. She knew the mountains, respected them, and understood when to turn back. She wasn't the type to take unnecessary risks, her brother said. If something happened, it wasn't because she made a mistake. Community members in the nearby towns felt the weight of the discovery as well. For years, hikers had walked those trails, assuming the greatest threats were weather or wildlife. Now, with rumors circulating about an unknown presence in the woods, afternoon coffee shop conversations turned uneasy. Regulars at the local diner speculated quietly about a hermit, a hunter, and a recluse, someone who lived beyond the edges of maps. People remembered odd encounters, small moments that felt insignificant at the time, a figure disappearing behind trees, a parked truck with no license plates, footprints in snow that led nowhere visible. Separately, each memory might mean nothing. Together, they formed a mosaic of unease. The sheriff's office released a statement urging calm, assuring residents there was no evidence of ongoing danger. But the deputy who delivered the message privately admitted that he did not believe it. Not fully. The cabin had remained untouched for years. If the person responsible was still alive, he had managed to elude detection across multiple jurisdictions, climates, and search operations. It was possible he had moved on to another region. It was just as possible he had not. As winter gave way to spring, search teams prepared to revisit the locations marked during the dark months. The hollow mentioned by the retired volunteer would be the first. Then the abandoned ranger path along the ridge, where a hiker once reported hearing footsteps that stopped whenever he stopped. Then the derelict mine entrance where a local trapper had found fresh cigarette ash despite the area being closed off for years. Every site represented another question, another thread, another possibility. And beneath all of it lay the same quiet truth. The mountains often held their secrets for longer than most people cared to imagine. But sooner or later, something shifted. Snow melted, roots loosened, wood decayed, and what had been hidden rose back to the surface. Investigators hoped the coming thaw would do exactly that. They needed one piece of evidence, just one, to turn suspicion into a name. Because somewhere inside that quiet zone, someone had once moved with absolute confidence. Someone who had led a woman into a cabin where a table waited for two. Someone who had vanished long before anyone realized they had been there at all. When the snow finally receded, the mountains changed character. The quiet, muffled stillness of winter gave way to dripping branches, exposed roots, and the slow thaw of earth that had held its secrets in suspension for months. Detectives, rangers, and forensic specialists assembled in the trailhead parking lot before dawn, preparing to enter the reconstruction phase of the search. Their goal was both simple and overwhelming: revisit every anomaly, every odd report, every half-forgotten detail that might now speak with the clarity that spring sometimes brings to old wounds. The first location was the hollow described by the retired search and rescue volunteer. The walk to reach it took nearly an hour through half-melted patches of snow and muddy terrain. As the team approached, some of the older members noted that the terrain was subtly different from what they remembered. Trees had fallen, roots had shifted, and the forest floor was less stable than it had been years ago. When they reached the hollow, they saw immediately that the volunteer had not exaggerated. The depression was unmistakably deliberate. The outline was too precise, the soil too compacted in the center. Moss had grown over some parts, but the general shape remained intact. Forensic tools came out: ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, and core sample kits. After several scans, the radar revealed something beneath the soil: an irregular formation with sharp edges. A buried object. The team worked carefully for hours, removing layers of earth until a rusted metal frame emerged. It was the remains of a folding camp cot. The canvas had long since rotted, but the metal legs were intact enough to identify. Next to it, partially collapsed, were fragments of a wooden crate. No human remains were found, but the evidence suggested the hollow had once been a temporary structure, possibly a hidden camp. It wasn't dug for storage, a forensic investigator said. This was a place where someone stayed, a lookout or a shelter. The discovery raised alarm among the team. The hollow sat less than 3 miles from the cabin. Whoever had used it knew the landscape intimately and appeared to have moved through it undetected for years. The second site was farther up the ridge, along the abandoned ranger path. This route was once part of the old forest monitoring system, but had fallen into disuse decades earlier. Local hikers rarely approached it. Even wildlife avoided the steep incline and broken rock shelves. The team moved in a single-file line, checking the edges of the trail for signs of disturbance. Near a narrow choke point where the cliff pressed close to the path, the lead investigator noticed something odd: smooth, deliberate marks on the rock wall. Not claw marks, not natural erosion. Knife marks. Someone had carved a small groove into the stone, perhaps as a waypoint or boundary marker. "What for?" a deputy asked quietly. "A guide," the lead investigator replied. "For someone who walked this path often enough to leave themselves a trail." From the ridge, it was possible to see the cabin's roofline far below. The angle was perfectly clear, unobstructed, and almost too convenient. Whoever used this ridge could have watched the cabin without being seen. They marked the coordinates and photographed the groove before moving on. The third location on their list was the derelict mine entrance, mentioned years earlier by a trapper who swore he'd seen fresh cigarette ash by the doorway. The mine was fenced off, its warning signs faded but still legible. The team approached cautiously, mindful of the soft ground and unstable beams. Inside, the air smelled of metal and dust. Piles of rock littered the floor. For a moment, it seemed like another dead end. Then, one of the investigators noticed something tucked into a crevice in the wall: a crumpled food wrapper. Another found a small piece of synthetic cord tangled around a support beam. And farther back, near the old equipment racks, someone spotted a metallic glint. It was a small tin container, the kind used to hold matches or fishing hooks. Inside were traces of wax and a single burned wick. A homemade candle. "This place was used recently," a ranger whispered. "Not decades ago. Not by accident." The implications were clear. The suspect had not only moved silently through the forest, but had also occupied multiple shelters, each hidden from the main trails. The cabin was only one piece of a larger network of places, caches, lookouts, and hideaways. The team cataloged everything, hoping to trace patterns of movement across the landscape. As daylight began to fade, they gathered by the trailhead to review their findings. The hollow suggested prolonged presence. The ridge carving indicated surveillance. The mine provided evidence of habitation. Together, these points formed a triangle around the cabin. The profiler studied the map and nodded grimly. He didn't stumble into that cabin, he said. He claimed it, maintained it. It was part of his territory, and he moved through it with confidence that comes only from repetition. The team understood the weight of this. They were not dealing with a hiker who had taken a wrong turn, nor an opportunistic criminal who happened upon the cabin by chance. They were confronting someone who had shaped their life around the land, someone who had lived in the margins between wilderness and isolation, unseen except in the traces left behind. And if he had lived this way for years, the next question became unavoidable. Where was he now? In the weeks after the discovery of the hollow, the ridge carving, and the mine shelter, the investigation shifted into what detectives privately called the narrowing phase. It was the point in a long-running case where the map stopped expanding and began contracting, where the web of unanswered questions slowly tightened around a smaller and smaller number of possibilities. What once felt like a vast, open wilderness filled with uncertainty now appeared structured, gridded, and etched with patterns left by a single, unseen presence. Detective Hartman, who had worked the case since the cabin's discovery, believed the suspect's movements formed more than a territorial loop. She thought they reflected a personal logic, a rhythm, a life lived according to rules he never articulated but consistently followed. She began reviewing every anomalous incident in the region over the last 15 years. Not just disappearances, but reports of strange encounters, abandoned camps, and sightings of a silent figure on remote trails. Patterns emerged almost immediately. One such incident came from an old ranger log from 2011. A ranger reported finding a fire ring still warm near a remote lake where no overnight camping was permitted. Next to the ashes lay a single metal cup, still upright, containing a thin layer of cold coffee. No footprints were found, no trash, no belongings. The ranger wrote in the margin, "Whoever it was knew how to leave nothing behind." Another incident involved a pair of hikers in 2014 who saw a man standing at the edge of a clearing at dusk. He wore a dark jacket, carried a pack, and said nothing when they waved. He simply turned and walked into the trees. They assumed he was a local, but after the cabin discovery made the news, they revisited the moment with unease. A third report described smoke rising from a valley during a burn ban. When firefighters arrived, the smoke was gone, and so was any sign of fire, except a faint trace of charred wood and a single boot print near the creek. None of these incidents were definitive, but taken together, they revealed a quiet trail of presence. A person who slipped into the forest and out again without being noticed, who stayed in places that were never meant for habitation, and who seemed most active during seasons when the mountains saw fewer visitors. While Hartman built her timeline, forensic analysts worked to reconstruct the cabin's history through micro details. They tested dust particles from windowsills, identifying layers corresponding to specific seasons. They examined soot rings inside the wood stove, mapping the pattern of usage. They even analyzed pollen trapped in cracks of the floorboards, revealing which years the cabin had been opened and which years it had remained sealed. What emerged was unsettling. The cabin had been entered multiple times over a span of 7 years, not continuously, but periodically, as if someone returned according to an internal schedule. Some years showed heavy disturbance. Others showed almost none. The year of the woman's disappearance aligned with one of the more active periods. The table, the one set for 2, became an obsession for investigators. Why set it? Why preserve it? Why leave it untouched? The profiler suggested that the table was not merely a scene but a statement. "A table is symbolic," he said during one meeting. "It assumes company. It assumes a ceremony. Whether she was alive when he said it, or whether it was staged afterward, the intention is the same. It reflects a desire for witness, for acknowledgement. Hartman considered this as she examined photographs of the plates. One chipped, one intact, one with faint traces of moisture rings, the other perfectly dry. She wondered whether the suspect had eaten there, or if the table was staged to represent what he believed a moment should look like. She wondered whether he had expected her to sit, or whether he had sat alone, imagining a conversation that never happened. Meanwhile, deputies canvassed every property within 20 miles of the quiet zone. They visited aging cabins, hunting shacks, trailers, and run-down farmhouses tucked into folds of the mountain where GPS signals faltered. In one abandoned barn, they found an old camp stove similar to the one in the cabin. In another, covered beneath hay bales, they discovered a sleeping bag and a lantern that matched models from outdoor suppliers operating a decade earlier. Most items were common, mass-produced, and impossible to connect directly to the case. But their existence indicated something important. The suspect might have used multiple fallback shelters, switching between them when he sensed danger or when seasons changed. And then came a break, not in the form of physical evidence, but from a person who had held silence for years. A retired fire crew member named Lewis contacted the sheriff's office after hearing about the revived search efforts. He recalled a moment in late autumn about 5 years earlier when his crew was patrolling an old fire road. They had parked their truck, walked a short distance into the trees, and stumbled upon a clearing where they noticed a man sitting on a large rock. He wore a hooded jacket and seemed comfortable, as if he belonged there. He didn't startle, didn't stand, didn't speak. He only looked at them with an unreadable expression. "What did you do?" the detectives asked. "We left him alone," Lewis replied. "Didn't seem like trouble, but something about him, something felt off, like he wasn't surprised to see us at all." When shown a general description sketch, one based not on a specific suspect, but on a composite of sightings, Lewis paused. Then he nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's close." It wasn't confirmation, but it wasn't nothing. For investigators, it deepened a growing realization. Someone had lived in those mountains, not for days, not for months, but for years. Someone who understood how to disappear within walking distance of 1,000 eyes. And if that person once sat at a table set for two, the only remaining question was how many other tables he had set that no one had found. As summer advanced and the investigation entered its third month of renewed activity, the search radius tightened further. What had once been a broad sweep of suspicion now contracted into a narrow corridor on the map. An elongated pocket of forest bounded by steep ridgelines, 2 old mining routes, and a forgotten service road that had long since fallen into disrepair. According to the profiler, this corridor wasn't just where the suspect traveled, it was where he lived. It was in early July, under a sky washed pale with heat, that the investigative team returned to the cabin for a full reconstruction. This time, instead of dusting for prints or swabbing surfaces, they entered with a different goal: to understand the suspect's pattern by physically retracing his movements. The forensic analyst, the profiler, 2 deputies, and Detective Hartman stood silently inside the doorway, looking around as if seeing the room for the first time. The table remained as it had been left: 2 plates, 2 forks, 2 glasses, and a cloth folded beneath the candle. The investigators didn't touch anything, but they studied each object with a new lens. The profiler moved his hand through the air, sketching an invisible diagram. "He placed her here," he said quietly, pointing to one chair. "And he likely sat there. He wanted symmetry, distance, a view of the door." "What about the candle?" a deputy asked. "He lit it," the profiler replied. "Not for her, not for ambience, for the ritual, for whatever story he was telling inside his own mind." The stove, which had been examined months earlier, now offered fresh clues. The soot patterns indicated the burner had been used multiple times, but with long intervals between each use. The heat damage on the metal revealed at least 3 distinct burn periods within a span of 2 years, long after the woman's disappearance. Someone had returned. Cooked. Saturday. Moved through the cabin. Hartman examined the windowsills again. A fine layer of dust lay across each one, but beneath it, the wood showed faint horizontal streaks. Someone wiped these, she said, but not thoroughly. Not recently. One of the deputies stepped outside to inspect the surrounding area. Fresh soil disturbance, small enough to go unnoticed before, now drew his attention. It was not from animals. It was from someone kneeling, likely to tie a boot, adjust a pack, or pause before entering. The depressions were shallow, but unmistakable. "He's been back," the deputy said. "Maybe within the last year." The realization settled heavily over the team. The owner of the cabin, the unseen presence, had not vanished after the woman's death. He had not fled nor abandoned his territory. Instead, he had returned with a predictability that suggested the cabin served as a psychological anchor, a place where he revisited whatever had occurred there 7 years earlier. The next significant break arrived not from the forest, but from the digital forensics unit. While reanalyzing satellite imagery from the years before and after the disappearance, a technician identified a pattern, a faint, recurring heat signature along the old service road that led toward the cabin. It appeared sporadically, always near dusk, always during late summer or early fall, and always in the same general location. The profiler studied the timestamps. He returned seasonally, he said, like a migration pattern, like someone who lives outdoors and cycles through territory the way animals do. Deputies were dispatched to that location, a gently sloping ridge covered in lodgepole pine. Despite heavy undergrowth, the team found clear signs of human passage, broken needles, subtle impressions in the ground, and a series of disturbed branches that formed a narrow opening between trees. Following the faint trail, they reached a small clearing where windfall logs surrounded a fire pit filled with ash. This time, the ash was recent. A forensic chemist collected samples, and the lab report returned the next day: burnt wood, animal fat, and traces of partially combusted synthetic fibers. The presence of synthetic material suggested clothing or gear had been in the fire. Someone had attempted to destroy something here and had done it not long ago. The team expanded their sweep. Not 40 yards from the fire pit, one of the deputies noticed a patch of flattened grass and a small depression consistent with the shape of a sleeping pad. Next to it, caught under a root, lay a fragment of cord, thin, tightly braided, and frayed at one end. When Hartman saw the cord, her expression changed. It matched the type used to lash items in the cabin. It matched the knots recovered from earlier shelters. It matched the pattern of the wrapped sleeping bag found in a previous, unrelated investigation years earlier in another county. A pattern was emerging, one that stretched far beyond a single county line or a single case file. The sheriff authorized a full-scale grid search of the ridge. Over the next 48 hours, deputies, rangers, and forensic volunteers combed the area. They found no living structures, no tents, and no obvious campsite. But they did find the remnants of snare wire traps, a circle of stones once used as a water filter, and a carved symbol on the bark of a dead tree. The symbol was old but clear, an X, not deep, not large, but deliberate. The same mark was found above the woman's body. The same mark was noted in older reports from different trail systems. The same mark that investigators had once dismissed as coincidence. Standing before the carved X, Hartman felt the case shift in her hands. This was not a random killer or a transient drifter. This was someone with a template, a ritual, a territorial imprint carved into the landscape itself. And now that imprint was leading them somewhere. The profiler stepped beside her. "He's escalating," he said. "Returning more often. Burning more often. Marking more often." Hartman looked at the symbol again. "No," she said quietly. "I think he's preparing to leave. And he's cleaning the traces as he goes." Because if someone had lived unseen in these mountains for years, the hardest question was no longer how he had hidden. It was what he intended to do next, now that the walls of the forest were finally closing around him. The final phase of the investigation began not with a dramatic discovery, but with a quiet realization shared among the team. The suspect's world was shrinking. Every site they visited, every hollow, ridge, clearing, and mine showed signs of a life being erased. The snare traps were empty. The hidden camp near the creek showed no fresh footprints. The fire pit that once held warm ash grew cold. Even the narrow paths carved by habitual travel seemed less defined, as if the forest were reclaiming them. It was as though the person they hunted sensed, in some instinctive way, that the circle was tightening, and instead of confronting it, he was preparing for disappearance. For the investigators, that possibility carried both relief and dread. Relief, because a retreating suspect posed less immediate danger. Dread, because retreat in a wilderness like this did not necessarily mean absence. It could mean relocation, reinvention, continuation in a place where no one yet knew to look. The final breakthrough came during a morning sweep of a high overlook above the cabin, the same vantage point where earlier teams had found faint trails and a clear, unobstructed view of the roofline below. The sun was just cresting the ridge, casting long shadows across the slope, when a deputy noticed something half buried beneath a cluster of stones. At first, he assumed it was litter carried by wind, but as he brushed away the debris, the object revealed its shape. A small metal cylinder, sealed at one end. Inside it was a thin roll of paper. Not new, not old, somewhere in between. The edges were frayed, but the writing was still legible. 4 lines, no signature, no names, just a message written in a rough, angular script. She walked too far. She stayed too long. The mountain keeps its dead. Leave what was hers. The team stood silent as the words were read aloud. The statement was not a confession, but it was not a denial either. It existed in a limbo of responsibility, a voice acknowledging presence, perhaps even ownership, without admitting action. The profiler read the line several times before speaking. "This isn't an explanation," he murmured. "It's justification." He sees himself as part of the landscape, as if the rules that apply to everyone else simply don't apply to him. The discovery of the cylinder triggered a final, meticulous expansion of the search around the overlook. For 2 days, investigators sifted through brush, soil, and rock. They found no signs of the suspect, no clothing, no tools, no traces of habitation. It was possible he had left months earlier. It was possible he had been watching them from somewhere they had not yet searched. Or it was possible, an unsettling but plausible theory, that he was no longer alive. If he had succumbed to exposure, injury, or time, his remains might never be found in the vastness of the mountains. The wilderness has a way of reclaiming what it wishes, and the quiet zone was large enough to hide him indefinitely. The case file ultimately concluded with 3 official statements. The woman died from injuries consistent with a violent encounter. The cabin had been used by an unknown individual over a span of many years. The identity of that individual remains unknown. Unofficially, investigators believed more strongly than ever that the suspect had been present during the woman's final days. They believed he brought her to that cabin or found her there and staged the scene with a ritualistic deliberateness that blurred the boundary between isolation and obsession. They believed he had spent years navigating the mountains with the ease of an animal in its natural habitat, leaving only the faintest marks of his presence. And they believed, with a weight that sat heavily on each of them, that the mountains had swallowed him as surely as they had swallowed the truth of what happened during those lost weeks 7 years before her remains were found. Months later, when the snow returned and the roads closed once more, the cabin sat alone on its plateau, its windows dark, its table still set for 2. Rangers who passed the area on long patrols reported feeling a strange stillness in the air around it, a quiet that was not empty but watchful, as though the forest itself remembered the events that had unfolded there, even if no one else ever fully could. For the woman's family, closure arrived in fragments. They held a small memorial on the outskirts of town, near a river she loved. They placed a smooth stone with her initials inside a circle of pine branches. They spoke softly, not about the details of her death, but about the life she had lived before the mountains took her. And afterward, they walked away, carrying the knowledge that though answers had come, they had not come cleanly, and they likely never would. For investigators, the case remained a reminder of something they all understood but rarely said aloud. That wilderness, however beautiful, is indifferent. It does not keep secrets out of malice. It keeps them because it can. And sometimes the only way to honor the truth that cannot be recovered is to remember the fragments that surfaced and to carry them forward. And for those of you watching, if you want to follow more investigations like this, for stories where the land holds echoes of unanswered questions, and cases where persistence, memory, and quiet observation finally bring lost voices to light, then make sure you're subscribed. Stay with us as we continue to explore the mysteries that refuse to stay buried.